Welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs podcast. Its 5-year mission to explore Star Trek arcs and themes, seek out new story directions, and boldly tell stories that no one has told before.
Hailing frequencies open, sir.
So welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs podcast. I am very honored today to have a very special guest. A writer on my favorite Star Trek series, Deep Space Nine, with almost 40 credits on that show alone, and a writer with Elementary and Alphas and all kinds of really great shows throughout the years, but also the author of a series of fantasy novels, which we will talk about at the end, Billy Smith, and is the last Goblin
and the Goblins,
and
just
the
all
Goblins.
the Goblins.
Yeah. And they're very well-reviewed books. I am waiting for a copy thanks to the mail delay. I was hoping to read that before we got here, but Robert, welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs.
Thanks.
Good to have you.
Yeah, good to be here.
So let's start. You are a UCLA film school graduate, right, from the screenwriting program?
Yeah, I have an undergraduate degree in film and a master's of fine arts in screenwriting. So I really just have no other skills. This is it. This is all I know how to do.
So you were locked in. You wanted to do this, right, from the beginning?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I was in film school, I discovered writing. I'd always wanted to write, but I discovered screenwriting, and that became my focus, and I decided to get a master's in it as well. So I mean, it was really just an excuse to get paid to write. I got a fellowship, and so I did 2 more years of school and wrote 5 more scripts, I think.
Right.
And yeah, it was great. It's a great school. The screenwriting department when I went there was terrific. Yeah, I learned a lot. Learned more on Star Trek than I did on UCLA, but I got the basics there.
Yeah, I'm sure you did, and we'll get to Star Trek in a minute. But from the beginning, were you always into science fiction and to that kind of stuff? Were you looking to write that kind of stuff when you were at film school?
Yeah, well, I grew up, reading YA science fiction novels and fantasy novels, and Lord of the Rings and the Narnia books and the Robert Heinlein young adult science fiction stuff that he wrote, Wizard of Earthsea, all that stuff. So I love that kind of material. And I tried to write a fantasy novel when I was very young. I think I was in like 3rd or 4th grade. And I tried to write another one when I was in high school and another one when I was in college. And they were all high fantasy type things.
Right.
And then I got into film school with a fantasy short story. So yeah, it was definitely a genre I always really enjoyed. And I think, the first 2 scripts I wrote, one was a fantasy comedy romance. And I got an agent out of that one. And the second one I wrote was a big science fiction epic, sort of like a futuristic Spartacus. And that's the one that got me. That's the writing sample I used to prove I could write for Star Trek Next Generation when they wanted to read a sample. Yeah. So yes, that was definitely it was a sweet spot for sure. I mean, I've written other kind of stuff too, and obviously now I've written a lot of mysteries too. But that was probably my first love.
So your first script for Star Trek was Fistful of Datas, but before that, did you give them a writing sample of just that script that?
Yeah. So the way it worked back in the day on Star Trek was that pretty much they had an open door policy. There were a lot of ways you could get into pitch, but they took a ton of pitches. They had small staffs and took a lot of pitches. And so, so my agent represented Joe Minosky, who was on Next Generation, and so sent in that script, the science fiction script that I wrote, that had almost gotten sold a few times. Subsequently, I did sell it twice. Twice. And they liked the script enough and they invited me to pitch. So that's how I got in the door, that script.
Well, and I submitted something in the 90s to the open door policy, but I had no idea what I was doing. And I got a really nice note back from Ira saying, great concept, but you need to learn how to write a screenplay. And it was, um, but we can talk about that more later because I thought that was really cool at the time. Like it was like a big deal for me because I was in college, but I just was so excited that I got a letter back, and
It was a great thing that Star Trek used to do, that open door policy. I think it was a tremendous. I mean, it was really Gene, I think, was the first original champion of it because he wanted the fans to have access to the show, and I think Michael Pillar continued that. He was also very passionate about that, and Jerry. And it was a lovely thing. I mean, and it started a lot of careers. I mean, I didn't come in through the cattle call, which is how your script would, where you would write an actual script for the show and then send it, and then it would be reviewed by a professional reader. Paramount had dozens, I don't know how many readers there were, but they would do coverage on it. They would read it and write notes. And if it got favorable coverage, it would get kicked up to someone on the staff to read, and we would respond to it. I don't remember that I ever responded with a note, so that was very sweet of Ira. I think it was usually a bit of a form letter.
Oh, it was very short, but it still meant a lot to me. But I was told at the time that was probably a sign that they liked the concept enough to.
Yeah, I think it was. What that says to me is that the readers passed it up. They didn't ding it. Like the readers said it was good enough to send up to someone above them, and possibly even someone on staff read it and passed it to Ira because they liked the concept. Because I don't remember Ira reading a lot of those spec scripts. So the fact that Ira read it at all meant that it at least got through one layer of like gatekeepers and maybe even two.
Right.
So that was but the rest of us, we had to read 10 or 15 of those a week, and we then took 3 pitches each a week. So of the staff,
that's how Brian Fuller started, right?
Yeah, I was the first person Brian Fuller ever pitched to in Hollywood because of that. A lot of people got their start that way. Ron and Renee came in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Ron Moore and Renee Echeverria came in that way. And there's been a lot of other really successful writers whose first gig was a pitch that they sold to one version of Star Trek or another. Henry Worksman, Gabby Stanton, I think the Coda brothers. I mean, just a lot of really good writers who've had really good careers in this business started out that way.
And I think you brought up a really good point that this goes back to Gene Roddenberry, because I think in my other podcast world is we do a podcast about Philip K. Dick. And so we cover a lot of the 60s new wave writers. And a lot of those writers, well, they didn't all get episodes made. Some of them did. But a lot of the 60s new wave science fiction writers, like Norman Spinrad wrote The Doomsday Machine.
Sure. Theodore Sturgeon.
Yeah, Theodore Sturgeon created Pon farr. All these like big names in science fiction, and it was really cool that Gene like brought them in. And I think recently for an episode I was doing research and I discovered that A.E. Von Vogt, who was a 40s sci-fi champion, had written 5 pitches that didn't get made. And when I looked them up, they were bananas. They were totally bonkers.
Yeah.
But it was cool that they were taking these ideas and thinking about them. And
yeah, I actually tried to do that a little on Andromeda for the time that I was there. I had one episode that was written by Steve Barnes, and another that was written by Walter John Williams, who were, the next, they were the cyberpunk wave.
Right.
And we reached out to some other people. But those are the 2 that actually got made.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It was fun.
Yeah, and so Fistful of Datas was your first script that got produced.
Correct.
But you didn't end up at TNG. Were you instantly recruited to the developing Deep Space Nine?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't know what happened behind the scenes. I know that they were staffing up on Deep Space Nine. I don't think they really had any. Well, they had an opening on Next Generation, but that went to Narain Shankar, who was the technical consultant, who actually was the science guy who filled in all the techie stuff. And I actually had a lunch with him when I was doing Fistful of Datas, and I talked to him about a lot of that stuff while he was still the science advisor. And then he got hired onto Next Generation, and they hired me. Well, they didn't hire me directly on Deep Space Nine. They brought me in to do a freelance episode. They had a story for Q-less. I don't even think it was called that. But they didn't. They weren't in love with it, and so they asked me to read it and pitch them what I would do with it. I told them I would change the title to Q-less, and then I sort of pitched out what I would do. Including, if I remember correctly, cut the entire final act. Like I was like, once this happens, the story's over, and none of this matters. And they liked what I had to say enough that they had me write the script, and then they liked the script well enough, and I guess the process of working with me, which in television is really important too, that they hired me onto staff. And so I came on in late October of, when did the show premiere? 91? Is that right? No. 93. So I came on in late 92, late October 92. I think they'd already shot Emissary by the time I was on staff. I think that they were shooting it when I was doing they might have been shooting it or had just finished shooting it when I was doing Q-less, and by the time I got onto staff, they were done shooting it, and I think they were shooting past Prologue or Man Alone. They were shooting one of the early episodes when I finally got hired. So I wasn't there from the very beginning, but I was there fairly early on. I was the fourth writer hired onto the show because, I mean, obviously Michael created it. Ira, he brought on right away. They brought Peter Allen Fields over from Next Generation. That's the slot that Narain took to replace him, and then they brought me over to Deep Space Nine.
And you did a very important thing in Q-less that still to this day. Yesterday, I just watched a video and somebody arguing that Sisko is the best captain, and like point number 7 was he punched Q. Right?
Yeah, well, yeah, we were one of the points of Q-less was to differentiate the show from Next Generation, and sort of have a character who'd seen both of those worlds commenting on what he thought of Deep Space Nine, and that character was Q. And Q's an ass, so like it was a lot of snark. And so I think, he had it coming at that point. And I think it just showed that Sisko was a different kind of guy than Picard was. I mean, he was thoughtful, and he could be a very persuasive and diplomatic person when he wanted to be, but he was also the kind of person that didn't need to take that kind of crap even from a god. And so he was certainly goated, but at some point he was just like, nah. And that, the Picard never hit me was a line I'm proud of, because I think it just said this is a different ballgame and this is a different guy.
Right. And it's obviously a moment that people to this day like factor into their love for Sisko. Sisko's my favorite captain too.
Thanks.
One of the reasons why I love Sisko, and I'm sure that you guys talked about this as early as the first season, is his the fact that he has a family and a family life, and his position on the frontier makes it, where, he's not warping off to a new adventure every week, and we get to see him develop his relationship with Jake, which, and I know it's very famous that Avery Brooks has said that is the key to what attracted him to the character. But
I think it's the key to the show in a lot of ways. I mean, I think that the fact that Sisko is a family man who doesn't warp away every week,
right,
is really the core of the show, and him growing from this reluctant hero to the sort of full throttle guy that he is at the end. But look, ultimately, like, monogamous,
right,
there for his son. I think that those were very important distinctions between Kirk, who was a terrible father, and Picard, who wasn't one at all, and neither of whom ever really had a real relationship beyond the ones with the ship and the crew. Sisko was a guy who was happily married, loved his son. When he met the White Woman again after Jennifer's death, that was it. Like, he wasn't like, he didn't need a girl in every port. He needed Cassidy.
Right.
And it was a mutual, it was a marriage of equals in both cases, Jennifer and Cassidy, but especially Cassidy. And so, you know, I think that was really Michael's impetus. That was really where Michael was coming from. Michael was a very devoted family man, very much in love with his wife, and tried to put his kids first, even in the crazy world of Hollywood. And I think, you know, he saw the show as, if Star Trek was Wagon Train, I think he saw the show as The Rifleman, a show about a guy on the frontier with his son trying to make the world a better place for his family. You know?
Yeah. The frontier aspect of it made it almost essential that you guys had to do the long form stories and the continuing stories, but people forget that that wasn't a thing before Deep Space Nine. And I tell people all the time that Deep Space Nine is super underrated on you know, the type of television that we watch today. And I know the documentary tried to make a good point about that, but I think it's almost better if it comes from people like us who are at home watching. But I don't remember a series telling almost novel-like storytelling over a series, over a season before Deep Space Nine. But you guys had to do it because, you know, you're a space station. And it's so funny because I think you guys took what everyone was saying was a weakness of the show. Oh, they don't go anywhere, right? And turned it into a strength. And of course, you guys went lots of places, but you know.
Yeah. Well, that was part of Michael's plan from the very beginning. I mean, we weren't the first show to ever do, you know, continuous novelized storytelling on television by far. I mean, there were definitely antecedents. I think Kill Street Blues is probably the most famous of them. But certainly, you know, you had Dynasty and you had Dallas, which were nighttime soaps. And then you had shows like Wise Guy that told stories like over the course of 3 or 4 episodes. But we definitely leaned into it, even more than I think certainly more than Paramount anticipated we would, or more than Rick Berman thought we were going to. But I think Michael always thought that was the way to go with the show. I think that also when you're on a station, you just can't help it. Like, you don't leave your problems behind every week. You don't fix them and leave them. You're there, and they don't go anywhere. And so I think very early on we realized that that was going to be a strength.
I want to talk about Michael Piller for a second because he's a writer I respect, and one thing that I really respect about him is not Star Trek related, which is that when USA Network first said that they were going to do a TV show based on The Dead Zone, which is one of my favorite Stephen King novels, my first reaction was, oh, that's a really bad idea. And then I heard Michael Piller is going to be showrunning it, and I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. And then I ended up hooked and watched the whole series and loved it. But
I wrote one of those too.
Yeah, I did notice that. But I think it's his sensibility as a writer. And when you were talking about the things that, you know, a family man, and I know his son was heavily involved in the Dead Zone, and I just think he brought like his humanity and his personality was so much a part of that show that it's one of the reasons why it worked. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but even though he wasn't with you guys all the way through Deep Space Nine, it really felt like he was a presence in the storytelling of Deep Space Nine even after he left.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, look, he set everything up. He ran the show for the first season and a half. He was always there if we needed him, and we would bounce things off of him. But he was definitely there when we were putting he was the guiding hand for all the characters. And certainly when we were putting the pieces together of the big arc and stuff like that, he was definitely involved. He was a lovely guy, a really deeply, you know, feeling person. And he really believed that was the key to being a good writer, to put that kind of feeling and love and emotion into the scenes and into the show. Yeah, he's terrific, and Dead Zone was terrific too. You know, he had a really, really great career. Unfortunately, we lost him too soon.
Yeah.
But yeah, he started a lot of careers. I think another thing that I appreciate is just how many writers' careers he started, how many actors he gave their first job to over the years, how many people he discovered, both in front of and behind the camera, how many directors he gave their first gig to. And it was just, you know, there's a lot of people in this business who owe their careers to him, and me included.
Well, in one way that his impact on Deep Space Nine that goes beyond the show is that when I interviewed John Ordover, who was the editor of the Pocket Books Star Trek series in the 90s, it was really interesting because he didn't come out right out and say this, but he was talking about like the challenges of writing Deep Space Nine novels when the show was still being produced and the characters were still being developed.
Yeah.
How hard it was for them because they were doing this as the characters were evolving. But what he did say was that, and he didn't come right out and say, but he said the Deep Space Nine characters were so much more drawn from the very beginning than when they were having to write Voyager novels, because they had a great understanding. And he said that from the very beginning that the Deep Space Nine characters, they had a really good idea of who Kira was, who Odo was. And well, sometimes it would change. And John's a very funny guy, so he has very funny quips about, like, you know, individual lines that drove him nuts because he was like, we went a different way with the novel, right? But I think that the characters and the way they were set up were so well defined, and that's a great thing. Now, Brian Fuller said something that I'm interested in hearing you comment on, is that he said that in the Voyager writers' room, they were always jealous of how geeky you could be in Deep Space Nine, and how you were not allowed to be a big Star Trek geek in the Voyager room. And he said that he used to get chastised if he brought up original series episodes that he really liked, or, you know, and he said he was jealous that in Deep Space Nine you could let your geek flag fly. Do you think that this is, how did you feel being in the Deep Space Nine room with that?
Look, I think you know, I think in the room we had definitely had a love for the original series in the Deep Space Nine writers' room. I think that more than Next Generation was what we sort of thought we were drawing from when we could, you know, in some ways. I can't speak to the Voyager room because I was never in it, so I can't really compare. I can't say that, you know, everyone's running around like with batless or anything in the Deep Space Nine room.
Right.
I think we were all fans with a small f. Because obviously at the end of the day, the writing came first, right?
Right.
But we loved and loved to honor the original series and the continuity of the show. So that's why, you know, Cassidy's from Cestus 3 and you know, why we would drop in references to things like Tholians and stuff like that, because we were just trying to, you know, make it feel like we were still, because I think people accused us maybe thematically and story structure wise of not feeling like Star Trek sometimes. I don't really agree, but I think that there was something of like, we sort of doubled down on our references and our love for the show because we really loved the universe that we were playing in. Again, I can't speak for what happened in Voyager. I wasn't there. But for us, it was, you know, I would say it was love more than fandom, if that's a weird, I know that's a weird thing, this weird distinction. But we were engaged every day in almost like a conversation with Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
Different kind of thing. When you actually have your hands on the steering wheel, I don't really think it's fandom. I think it sort of kind of is a different thing. It's hard to explain.
In that regard, that leads me to asking about now you have to balance the character development and the world building is such a huge part of writing science fiction. And since Star Trek, you're working in that world. And yes, you guys got all kinds of neat little things like Cassidy being from Cestus 3 and fun stuff like that all the time. But that balance between how much do you think that, I don't know, did you enjoy the character building or the world building more when you guys were in the room together?
Oh, it's always about character first for me, I think, and for most writers. I think world building is fun, and I enjoy it a lot. I mean, I've certainly done a lot of it, but ultimately that'll have to be in service of character, you know? So even like in the novels, there's a lot of world building in my novels, but it's all about like what's happening to those characters. And the world itself is just, you know, you want to make it rich and interesting, but if the characters aren't interesting, no one's going to follow them, no matter how lovely the world is. You know, and I can't think of, I'm sure there's examples, if I thought long enough and hard enough, I could tell you some examples of amazing world building with boring ass stories and not great characters. You know, and a lot of those things don't abide in the same way that Star Trek does. You know, I think if it wasn't for Kirk and Spock and McCoy and Uhura and everybody else, all that wonderful world building, the Federation, Starfleet, none of that would have mattered.
Right.
And I think it's the same with Deep Space Nine or any good TV show. It's got to be about characters. It's got to move you emotionally. World building doesn't move you emotionally, right? I mean, people don't get moved to tears by the fact that the Klingons are into opera.
Right.
You know, they're moved to tears by Worf losing Jadzia. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why in the name of this podcast, arcs is right there, because like to me, the arcs are one of the most important things that drive Star Trek. World building is details. These are like nice little things, but
sure.
But the arcs are what drive the show altogether, and that balance is a huge part of it. Now, working with Ira, like he came into the show a couple years later, but he became so much of a part.
No, he was there from the very beginning.
He was there from the beginning.
Ira was there from the very beginning.
Right.
He became the showrunner after Michael went on to do some other projects, Voyager and Legend, and so he became showrunner after a couple of years. But no, Ira was there for the whole 7-year run.
Gotcha.
Ira was the only person there for the whole 7-year run.
Gotcha. And so, but Ira is so much a heart of Deep Space Nine, and the fact that he's kind of keeping it alive with the documentary is so great, because I think for fans of Deep Space Nine specifically, you know, his heart and his passion for it is really means a lot to us as fans. But a lot of your scripts, like you're co-credited with Ira, but I feel like Ira was, being the showrunner, he probably could have been co-credited with everything at some point. But
well, look, certainly there could have been a lot more. Our names could have, you know, everyone on staff could have put their names on a lot more scripts. Ira instituted a policy actually against that. Michael, as far as screen credits were concerned, for the writers, tried to sort of put up on the screen what he believed was the more or less accurate credit, which is why I have my name on a show like, you know, Passengers, where I did a rewrite along the way. Mm-hmm. That's why Brandon's name is on A Fistful of Datas. He did a ton of work on it, deservedly so. But Ira instituted a policy where we would no longer do that. We would not put our names on anything we rewrote.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of episodes where we did a lot of work and our names just aren't on them, because that's not how Ira rolls. His opinion was that your name is already on it. It says right there, executive story editor Robert Wolfe, or supervising producer, you know, or executive producer Ira Bear.
Yeah.
The scripts where we share credit on are ones where we wrote them together, literally sitting in the same room. Usually Ira's office, with me at the not typewriter really, no, we already had computers, but me at the keyboard and Ira dictating and us giving and taking, and that was the structure. Now, he was the showrunner, So at the end of the day, like,
Right.
if it was a tie, it went to, we did it Ira's way. But he was very generous and very collaborative. He still is. And so, he certainly gave me a lot of leeway to contribute. And so both of our names are on the scripts that we wrote together from the scratch. And then, it even got to a point where very generously, he didn't have to do this. He even agreed to alternate the order of our names in the episodes so that my name would come first sometimes, which was really sweet of him. And he also still let me write episodes on my own without him, so that I could continue to grow as a writer. So he's a tremendous mentor, and I love him dearly.
And I have a lot of respect for Ira because he brought on my writing mentor and one of my favorite writers in the world, John Shirley, to write an episode of Deep Space Nine. And John wrote the introduction to my short story collection, and I know Ira specifically loved John's 1978 science fiction novel City Come a Walking, and just the fact that he was a big fan of that novel, which I think is an underrated masterpiece to this day, is like a little thing that I always remember about Ira that I think is really cool. But you two wrote one of the most important episodes of Star Trek, which is really important in this particular year and is getting a lot of attention this year, because a lot of people, there was a meme going around this year that was saying like, hey, I love how optimistic Star Trek is, but could they have told us how they got there? And those of us who are big Deep Space Nine fans are like, hey, they did that. Specifically in Sense, which is a two-parter that you and Ira wrote. And
Renee Echevarria co-wrote the second half.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. It's okay.
But past tense is a very important building block in Star Trek. And in 2020, you guys had to feel like you were seeing a little bit of that world kind of, it's that science fiction dilemma that when enough time goes by, you don't want to see the things that you wrote starting to come true.
Yeah, we certainly didn't want it to be prophetic. It's supposed to be a cautionary tale.
Right.
I think that's what's her name? Handmaid's Tale. I think that's what she says about, the author says about that book too. We were really trying to talk about homelessness, which was an issue of the time, and also just sort of about the Federation, about who Sisko was, about what Bashir and this sort of how would these men be if they were not in the Federation? Like, the Federation allowed them to be better people than they were because post-scarcity and Starfleet and all that good stuff, right? How evolved really are the humans of the Star Trek era was a question of interest to us. And so, I think that episode has aged pretty well. Those two episodes have aged pretty well. And we also didn't do a lot of prediction. I don't know if you've watched them recently, but people give us a lot of credit because we got a lot of things right. This sort of internet billionaires and cable news and all that, internet stuff. But I think, those were small predictions. And again, what we were really trying to do was tell the story of those characters in that situation. So I'm glad we got things right-ish. Computers don't look anything like what our computers look like, obviously. And those ridiculous ties. Who would wear? No one wears those. But yeah, I mean, we got the feeling tone of the 2020s pretty right so far, I would have to say, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes. And I think one of the keys too in the past tense and the two-parters was that you got to see the difference between how the three characters you were thrown back in time, like Jadzia, who appears white to the people. They obviously don't know that she's Trill, she's a symbiont. But and versus what happens to Bashir and to Sisko and how they're treated, and subtle, look, Star Trek has taken a lot of swings at racism, and I think that like the best ones are the ones that are done subtly like that, where sometimes and
Yeah,
I,
we certainly never say straight up, like, look, the two brown men got thrown in an internment camp, and the white girl with the tattoos on her head, she's fine.
yeah,
But
exactly.
it's
It's
it
there.
was not an accident. It was not an accident that those are the characters that get stuck in the internment camp,
Yeah.
and that's the character that is, doing just fine out in the world. That was a very conscious decision.
Okay, and so I got one that I'm really interested in because of like the whole like one of the things I was hoping this podcast would do too is that for people who are aspiring writers or starting writers that the first commentary that I did, I was amazed at how many of the Star Trek fans that I talked to were not thinking about when a couple of the people that were up in pitchforks about Picard were not understanding how a story arc works, right? And they were mad that the Federation was in shambles at the beginning of Picard. And of course, to me, it was like, well, look, it's a story arc, and the whole show is about this one man who is trying to stand up for his ideals, right? And so that's why I compared it to Last Jedi, because as much as the fans were upset that the Federation was like not in a good place, right? It's obvious to me that after a couple Borg invasions and a war with the Dominion, that the Federation would be stressed, right? And so, like, but you guys did such great stuff with how you moved arcs forward. So I am talking about what they're doing now, but I want to go back to when you wrote that episode Adversary. You guys gave yourselves a lot of paths that you could go with at the end of that episode. I know it was specifically written to take you in different paths, whether the Dominion War or something else. How much did you guys explore other story directions for Deep Space Nine, and how weird might it have gone if it had gone other ways? Because it seems like that was the biggest fork in the road the whole time you guys were doing Deep Space Nine.
We talked about everything. Everything was on the table whenever we sat down to start talking about the next season and the shape of it. I mean, I think we threw out all kinds of crazy ideas here and there. Mm-hmm. I don't remember any of them specifically. It's been a long time.
Right.
Because a lot of them were just thrown out and dismissed like in 5 minutes. That's part of the thing with the writer's room. It's like, next season, let's open with, the Romulans attacking. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Maybe not. I think was Adversary. Now, like, I'm trying to put my head together with the timeline. Adversary was the end of season
2, or
2.
Well, it's set up the search.
No. Jem'Hadar. Are you talking about Jem'Hadar? Jem'Hadar was the end of season 2.
No, I'm talking about Adversary. When you guys had Odo, it's right before the search. So you guys were setting up the whole, like, what is the Dominion? Because at that point we didn't know.
That's the Jem'Hadar. That's the Jem'Hadar.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's the end of season 2. Adversary, I think, is the end. Is the end of Adversary is We're Everywhere. It's the one on the ship where it's like there's a changeling on the ship on the Defiant, and they're trying to fight the Zenkethi, and it's like very edgy, silent running, and the Thing type thing. No, the Jem'Hadar was the one where we really introduced the Dominion. The biggest single change from our original concept of what we were going to do in season 3 and what we did do was from Michael, which was when we pitched out the Dominion to Michael and we told him that Odo's people would eventually be revealed to be the Founders. We had planned to take at least a season and maybe 2 to get there, where that was going to be a big mystery. And the whole thing was going to be about who are the Founders, how do we neutralize them, how do we get to them, all that kind of stuff. But when we told him that Odo's people were the Founders, he loved the idea so much that he said, it's too good an idea to hold. Let's just get right to it, because he could see that that was going to be a great story for Odo for 5 years. Why wait? Why wait 2 years and only do that story over the course of 3 years? Why not get to it?
Mm-hmm.
And that the founders would just be a great adversary. So why wait?
Right.
And so that was the biggest single change probably in the show, as far as like stuff that we pitched to Michael, and then the way that it turned out was that he wanted to speed that all up. So that's what we did.
And Michael,
I think rightly so. It worked out great.
Michael wasn't in your writer's room too. You were just having the conversations with him, right? As an advisor, or
he was still the executive producer. He was still giving us notes, and we were still like major story points like that. We were still clearing with him, and he still gave notes on every episode, but he wasn't day to day in the writer's room. He was very busy with Voyager.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, he wasn't like there every day. And so when we had a lot of these preliminary discussions about the Dominion, he wasn't involved, but we then brought him up to speed and pitched him things, and we'd get his feedback, and then we go with that. So, so that was the biggest single change. I think that the introduction of the Defiant was something we really wanted. At the end of season 2, we were already pushing for the Defiant. We were pushing to shave Sisko's head. That took a little while longer. We were pushing for him to grow his beard. That took a little while longer too. Those things might have happened faster, maybe in some weird world, but there was a lot of impediments to the sort of even further badassification of Sisko. But the Defiant was really the big fight that we were fighting, and that wasn't a fight with Michael. That was a fight with, like, Paramount and all the powers that be. And it turned out great. Everything worked out. But that, yeah, you're right. That was a big turning point in the show.
Was there friendly competition between you guys and Voyager since you were going at the same time, or?
I mean, we give each other shit in the hallways, but we're all in the same building. But no, I mean, like, first of all, like, Voyager was so important to Paramount. They were launching an entire network with it. I mean, there was no question that they were going to get all the promotional money and everything else. We were already used to that because they already gave everything to Next Generation,
Right.
So we just soldiered on. So no, I mean, we were always going to be the middle child.
Yeah.
I think that we just did the best job. The only thing, like, the only times there were ever any issues with Voyager were like when it felt like there were things that they needed that we, so like we were originally going to name the Defiant the Valiant, and because it began with a V, they said you got to rename it because of Voyager. And we were told we could never do any Borg stories or Q stories because they were going to be a huge part of Voyager. And so we didn't. It would have been nice to tell Borg stories, to be honest, just because of Sisko, but we weren't able to do that. But other than that, like, in exchange, we got the entire Alpha and Beta Quadrant and all the Star Trek history and all the aliens, and we got the Klingons and the Romulans and the Vulcans, and we got everything.
Yeah.
So, like, we traded those things, a starship beginning with the letter V, the Borg, and Q, and in exchange we got everything else. So it was a fair deal.
Did you guys ever explore any of those Borg ideas before you were told no, or?
We discussed them for sure.
Yeah.
But we were told no very early. Like, it was pretty early on that they were sort of already developing Voyager, and they knew that there would be the Borg were going to be like part of the big baddie of it all. And the movie too, First Contact too, was also like Borg heavy. And so, yeah, we just knew we weren't going to get those. And so we gave up pretty quick. I mean, it wasn't like we fought for it. It was sort of like,
yeah,
okay.
I want to say too, I'm not anti-Voyager. Here, Catherine Janeway and I share the same hometown. And, on this podcast, I interviewed the people who built the monument, which is 2 blocks from a house I used to live in. So
nice.
So I'm not anti-Janeway. In fact, I think Janeway was a great captain.
Sure, she's a great character.
Yeah, and so I'm pro Voyager, but I think I've always just been a Deep Space Nine guy. What do you think about? I think all the shows seem to Next Gen. When you guys were in the Berman era, it seems like after season 3, stuff really kicks in. It's not the Next Generation. The first 2 seasons are very rough, and I'm just being honest. And I think Deep Space Nine and Voyager had some earlier stuff going on better, but there's definitely a degree where you guys hit your strides after season 3 in that era. Do you have any theories on? I've always wanted to ask somebody who was in the garage, like, what it was, because I keep telling people with Discovery, even though I'm a fan of Discovery, like, they're only 2 seasons in. Let them get their stride, you know?
I think it's just that, though. I really do think that, like, especially when we were doing 26 episodes a year, you'd think that means you have more time to work out what the show is and how to do it, right? But the truth is, like, you're working so fast. So we're 5 writers on the staff. Like, the Next Generation staff was really small, too. It had a huge amount of turnover. Deep Space Nine staff had a little less turnover, but we still only had 4 or 5 people to write or supervise 26 episodes a year. And so we were just scrambling. And I think that's probably why all 3 of those shows seem to get better and better with time. You figure out the characters more. You figure out production-wise what you can do well and what you can't do well. You can fine-tune the visuals. You understand the kinds of stories that work well on the show and those that don't. There were definitely things that, work better on Deep Space Nine than other things. I mean, I would say, we weren't great at romance. We did okay. But it wasn't our strongest thing that we did. And so we had some early missteps in that direction. And I think Second Sight, I think we found our ground. And I think the same thing happened with Next Generation. They figured out the kind of stories they could do. They figured out they needed to focus more on Picard. They improved a lot of the things that didn't work visually. Same with Voyager, they shuffled up the cast a little. We shuffled up the cast a little, so did they. And it just, it's just, I think, one of those things, like, pro basketball team usually doesn't gel when you get all the pieces together in the first 20 games or whatever. Sometimes it takes a year or 2 even before they finally start playing well together. And I think it's the same with television. It's just the nature of the beast.
All right, so I got 2 more Star Trek questions, and I want to talk about your books.
Sure.
2 of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine, and you were involved in writing them, is the Paradise Lost and Homefront arc. To me, this is one of my favorite, and I know it seems like when I was looking at some of the quotes that Ira has had on it, that he was kind of down on those episodes because he felt like he had grander plans for them, it seemed like. But
well, they were originally supposed to be the opening of the season, I think, and then we got Worf, and we had to push them back, and we spent all our money on Way of the Warrior. We had no money left for those 2 episodes, so they became much more contained than what we originally saw them as, like, giant epics with, like, a civil war on Earth, basically, and a kind of attempted coup, and we thought that they would be very sweeping and grand episodes, and so they became much more sort of character studied, much quieter, and much more focused. But yeah, that's why Ira was a little disappointed, I think, was because he still sees in his head the versions of those shows that would have had the budget of a season opener instead of the budget of, like, episode 8 or 9 or whatever they ended up being.
Okay, I lied because you just gave me something that I wanted to ask you about, but I think you'll appreciate this question. One of the things that happens in that arc is one of my favorite moments on Deep Space Nine, when the Defiant is being attacked by another Starfleet vessel, and Worf has the line, "We fight." What do we do? It's one of my favorite moments on Deep Space Nine. But Worf is such an interesting character. He's been getting a lot of attention lately because people have been making a lot of jokes about how he's the worst dad in Star Trek. And that Worf, one of the things I loved about how you guys did things with Worf is you had him seriously ruin an important mission in order to try to save the love of his life, who eventually dies really soon after that, which is super heartbreaking. But I loved how much you guys gave Worf flaws towards the end of the show. Was that were you guys talking about that, or did it just accidentally keep happening?
No, I mean, he was one of our characters, and our characters had flaws. Like that was, you know, once we got Worf, we embraced him as one of our characters, and we just approached him the way we approached all of our characters, and tried to give him flaws and have him make mistakes and pay for those mistakes and learn from them and be challenged psychologically. All of those things. Again, I can't really speak for Next Generation, but I can just say that's what we did with all our characters. And you know, one of the lovely things about Michael Dorn as an actor and Worf as a character is he could say a lot with a little. Like you give him that, you know, two-word line, and man, he will. I mean, he could give a great speech too. Don't get me wrong, yeah. But like he just had great timing and great presence, and so we fight. You know,
yeah.
That's you know, that's gold for Michael, and gold for Worf, and it was a great moment.
Well, and I know Worf's getting a lot of gruff lately for that, but as a writer, I appreciate that as a character thing. Like, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's, you know, it makes him a better character and I could see that writers would just really enjoy writing him. You know?
I'd like to think that when Worf made a mistake on our show, it was usually a mistake that anyone would make, and in fact, few could recover from, but he could. On our show, he didn't point his phaser at the view screen, you know? Like, we gave him his due as a Starfleet officer and as a soldier and as a warrior. He didn't get his ass kicked very often on our show, but he did get into difficult situations where he had to make hard choices, and sometimes he chose ways that you would arguably object to, you could argue against, but they were from a place of character, you know? And were they wrong? I mean, was he wrong to try to save her? Was he wrong what he did to his brother? They're debatable, right? And that's the best drama.
Right. Now, in your very last Deep Space Nine episode that you came back to do, after I believe you were already doing Andromeda, you did something that has always... I just thought this was a really cool decision that you made, and I know this was yours. You wrote a Vulcan serial killer. Did people?
I did that. Yes, that was my decision, I think.
Right.
That was me. Yeah, guilty.
Did the staff give you shit about like having the serial killer in the Jadzia episode, or it was Ezri episode? Excuse me.
The Ezri episode.
Yeah.
No, because I made it make sense, right? I mean, I it was all about, like, the whole point of the episode was how war breaks people, right? Mm-hmm. And he was a serial killer because he'd been broken by war, because his logic fell apart, you know? I've always believed that, I mean, Vulcans have always been portrayed, and I've always appreciated the fact that they're not innately logical. They're not totally logical from birth. They work at it, you know? They have all the emotions. They just work their philosophy. And this was a guy for whom his worldview blew up. And I think it was a way to show the damage to the Federation that the Dominion War was doing. That was the idea. And I came from a military family. And so I'd sort of seen, some people with PTSD and issues because of war. And I thought that was an interesting way in, to see the Vulcan break down, to see the Vulcan fall apart, to see the Vulcan go bad, just spoke to how horrible things were really going for everyone. That was the idea.
Well, and it was a great decision, and I think the franchise went that direction a lot with Enterprise doing all the Vulcan or the logic extremists and that whole thing that they.
Yeah.
So I think you broke some ground there. So let's talk about your trilogy of fantasy books.
Sure.
And I think the rabbit hole fantasy novels, they don't get old because they're kind of in amber, and they're a great.
Although Amber technically wasn't a Portal novel.
Oh yeah, true. Roger's left.
But no, yeah, sorry, bad fantasy novel pun.
That was a great fantasy pun. I I appreciate it. But Billy Smith and the Goblins books. Give the pitch for the Star Trek fans who may not have discovered it yet.
So they're YA novels. Are really aimed at like 10 to 14, although I've had lots of people read them that are much older and appreciated them. But the basic plot is it starts out as your sort of typical portal or rabbit hole fantasy novel where three high school students from our time, modern high school students, on the first day of school get sort of weirdly transported to another world. And but the twist is that they arrive in this world right after the big climactic battle between humans and goblins, and they get rescued by the goblins. And the goblins have a prophecy that whenever they're in trouble, a human child will appear in the caverns beneath their city and become their king and save them. And the goblins are in a lot of trouble because they've just lost essentially the Battle of Minas Tirith. And in this world, the humans have had it. They're fed up with the goblins, and they're going to come to the goblins' city, and they're going to kill every last goblin. They're going to commit genocide. So the goblins have their backs up against the wall. And so that's where it sort of takes the deviation. I said like Narnia was one of my favorite series of books when I was a kid, but you know, one of the things I feel is that they don't completely age well, the Narnia books, in that, like, you know, the leads are white British school kids, you know, from the 40s, and you know, especially in Prince Caspian, they kill a whole lot of brown people. And I just wanted to sort of show a world where the people you think of the bad guys, the goblins, aren't, and where the kids aren't who you would expect to be the standard heroes of a fantasy, just like Cisco wasn't the typical starship captain. So Billy Smith is mixed race. He's half Irish American, half black. He is a kid who's never fit in anywhere. His family's moved from place to place his whole life, kind of like mine did when I was a kid. And weirdly, he finds his place in this world. And the other two characters, you know, Lexi is his first day of high school crush, and she's Filipino American. And she's the wizard of the three of them when they come to this world. She's by far the most powerful of the three, this little 5'0" girl from Pacifica. And then the third character is the high school quarterback, who's the only white character in the entire book, and he's kind of an a-hole. So it has the diversity of Star Trek. It also has the world building, I think, of Star Trek. I tried to treat the goblins the same way we treated the Klingons or the Ferengi or the Jem'Hadar or the Vorta. I tried to really dig into their world and their culture. And I think Star Trek fans should enjoy some of that. There's like a glossary of goblin words at the back, so they can learn some goblin the same way they learned Klingon if they want. And it's a clean trilogy. Like, I promise, like 3 books, beginning, middle, end. Like, it's not like I'm not trying to spin this thing out for 10 books. Like, I promise you, I deliver like an entire story in 3 books. It's like 1,500 total pages, probably less than that. Like, let me do the math. Yeah, like 1,000 pages, somewhere in there. It's like 1,000 pages for 3 books. You get the whole story, beginning, middle, and end. There's lots of great battles and all that kind of stuff. But I think also what people will recognize who are Star Trek fans is some of the philosophical and sort of humanistic point of view, which informs the work too.
Absolutely. Now, and I'm interested in why you chose to not. Did you develop this as a script or anything before that, or was it always a novel in your head?
Everything I think about first is always a script, because that's how I make my living.
Right.
But the thing with these books is that there are more eventually, but there are basically 3 human characters, and every other character is a goblin. And the 3 human characters are all like 15, 16 years old. It would be very difficult and very expensive to produce them.
Yeah.
And so I always thought
you'd almost have to shoot them back to back so they wouldn't age.
You'd have to shoot them back to back so the kids wouldn't age. About 6 months maybe goes by in the whole thing.
Yeah.
You'd animate it. So it was like, I didn't really think it was a good idea to write a script that was really just the first of a trilogy, you know, with that would be so expensive. I felt like the novels were a better proof of concept for the story. but also I just felt like I wanted to write a novel again, or try to, and I managed to finish this one, and I managed to sell it, and I managed to sell 2 more, you know.
Right.
And so it just sort of all unfolded kind of organically. But I'm proud of them. It felt really great to finish the 3rd one. I'm glad it's out there. You know, and I think if people read them, they'll enjoy them. And, you know, if it's too much to commit, like, use your Audible credits, everyone. You've all got Audible credits sitting around. I know you do.
Well, the audiobook was my next question because the reviews for the audiobook are very, very, very good. And it looked like, did you produce the audiobook?
No, I didn't have anything to do with it, which,
Okay.
you know, if I had, it was interesting because they never asked me, which was one of the funny things. I was like, if you'd asked me, like, I could have gotten you, like, you know,
Really
I could have
great.
gotten I could have gotten a great actor to read this thing. I think the guy that did it, Corey Gagne, did a great job, but I, you know, I would have gotten Sirach Lofton for you, you know, or like, you know, or I would have gone. Yeah, I didn't want an English accent, but yeah, because these are American kids. But yeah, like I could have gotten, you know, a lot of really cool people, and it would have been really fun to produce them. But it just, you know, whatever. They didn't really like. They don't. It's not how they see their authors in the publishing world all the time, especially first-time authors. So they do it their way, and it's all good.
So did they treat you very much like a first-time author, even though you?
Totally.
Oh, right.
Totally. Yes. Yeah.
Even though you have all those credits in Hollywood, but okay, but
you know, it is what it is.
was there a big challenge in writing for YA, or did that really?
It felt right for these books. It felt right for this story. Like that would be the audience you'd write for. You know, I had to dial back some of the violence and language and stuff like that, or be suggestive in places. Careful with the, you know, the young love aspects of it all. You know, I may have been too conservative in places. I know that there's a lot of YA books are way racier than these books are. I definitely was writing for, you know, like I said, 10 to 14-year-olds. I wanted it to be like wholesome, I guess. But that was a little bit of a challenge. There's definitely moments where I had to dial things back a little bit or be a little less descriptive, but not too much.
The dogs are starting to get restless here. I'm almost done. Yeah, they look really cool. I'm excited to dig into them. Are you gonna write more books? Is novels the thing you want to come back to, or?
Novels take a long time, man. I mean, they're a lot of work. They take me years to write a novel. It takes me years to write a novel. Like I can write an episode of television in a week or two. And I get paid a lot more for one episode of television than I get paid for one novel.
That's true.
The economics of it, you know, if someone were to throw a bunch of money at me, I'd happily write novels forever. Like, you know, I'd enjoy it. If these had blown up and if they were like the next Harry Potter, maybe you know, that would be my future. But, you know, I'm a television writer first and foremost, you know. Probably I think of myself first and foremost as a television writer. Next is a movie writer, because I've sold some novels, even though I've sold some movies, even though they've never gotten made. I've actually made a decent living as a movie writer too. And then novels are probably my, you know, number 3, just in order of like what pays the mortgage.
Have you thought about turning any of those movies that you sold that haven't been produced into novels or anything like that? Or
yeah, I have this one, but now it's certain maybe has some signs of life. So I have a feature I wrote a few years ago that's like this super violent, like modern Western that there's a producer attached to right now, and they're trying to get a director.
That sounds and that sounds right up my alley.
And as a novel, like it would be a complete departure from from the books I've written so far. It's much more sort of in the you know, airplane thriller, you know, like it's that kind of thing. Like, you know, it's got probably a cool name and a lurid cover, and you know, It's good for a couple cross country trips if you're a businessman. It's that kind of thing. So yeah, I have actually worked on turning that into a novel. I've actually written like 3 chapters of it. But now maybe it'll be a movie instead, and that would be great.
Oh yeah, that sounds fantastic. Well, and I know like some people have made entire careers out of unproduced scripts. Like really,
Yeah.
really funny. But
That's the feature world, man. It's hard. I mean, it's even harder now than it was when I started. I've sold 6 or 8 features. Come real close a few times, but they've just never gotten made.
Yeah, my John Shirley, and he wrote the first draft of The Crow, right?
Right.
He has adapted probably 9 novels that haven't been produced. That he always says, "Hey, they got the house," and he's always like, and
yeah, it's tough. I mean, we all write what we do because we want to be read or seen, so that's a little tough psychologically to do that. But yeah, you can make a living in this town writing movies that no one ever sees. I don't recommend it, but you can do it.
All right, Robert, it's awesome talking to you. I'm such a fan of all the work that you guys did. One of the things that I've always appreciated about Deep Space Nine is that I think of you guys as a collective all the time. And so it was really exciting to see the documentary, to see you guys working on a season of Deep Space Nine. I wish we got. I know, me personally, I think Jake Sisko covering the war as a reporter and the aftermaths is something that they should put into Picard. And I want to put it out there to the world that I think Jake Sisko should return as a reporter. And I think that's something that I'd like to see happen. And I think
I'd love that. And Sirach is such a lovely person and a terrific actor. It'd be great. It'd be great. He'd be terrific.
And but I really appreciate your time, and thank you for talking to us about all the work that you did with Star Trek. You did a lot of great stuff for the franchise, and I hope fans will check out your novel. I know I'm looking forward to it. I review everything on my blog, so look forward to that. And so people definitely go and buy Billy Smith and it's Goblin Crown, right?
The Goblin Clowns. It's the Goblin Crown, the Fallen Star, and the Final Drop. Those are the 3 books.
Awesome.
All available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and wherever your internet books are sold.
Right. And yeah, I really appreciate your time today.